An academic review on the namesake written by Jhumpa Lahiri. Regarded as a writer with a considerable repute in the Indian diasporic canon, Jhumpa Lahiri documents the identity crisis of an Indian immigrant family in her novel Namesake, given their exposure to transcultural and transnational experience. The novel was originally published in 2003. Ashok and Ashima represent the first-generation immigrants, whereas Gogol, Sonia, and Maushimi represent the second generation. Ashima and Ashok can be regarded as immigrants who are torn between the exigencies of self-recognition in a hostile land and the loyalty towards ethno-religious traditions of the homeland. Nair, 2015. According to M.L. Hansen, while the first-generation immigrants struggle to adjust into the host culture, the second generation fights to forget the culture of their origin, which characterize the tension in the narrative. The story begins with an account of Ashima, soon to become a mother, exerting herself on producing a Bengali dish in her apartment and Central Square in America. The contradiction between the setting and the type of dish she is attempting to make signifies a state of in-betweenness and refusal to completely assimilate into the host culture. Although Ashima lives in United States, her cultural and ideological baggage is deeply rooted in India, leading her to develop a state of inner conflict. Her decision to marry Ashok and settle in America has changed her identity in two ways. On the one hand, she has become a part of a diasporic community, and on the other hand, she is on the verge of attaining motherhood. However, what troubles Ashima the most is not the pain she undergoes during her pregnancy, but to perform her role as a mother in a foreign land, detached from her community and with no entity to identify herself. Ashima's identity is reconstructed once more with her husband's death, compelling her to perform the identity of a widow responsible for her own life. In the initial stages of the narrative, Ashima was viewed as a mere dependent on her husband, Ashok. However, as she proceeds with her life, the reader begins to witness a simultaneous development in her character and identity. Although she does not uproot herself entirely from her Indian identity, she manages to adapt into the mainstream way of living, forming a dual identity. Towards the latter part of the novel, the reader observes that Ashima has evolved into a character that traditional Bengali women, such as Ashok's mother, would consider humiliating. Eating alone, driving herself to work in snow and sleet, seeing her children and grandchildren at most 3 or 4 times a year. Lahiri, page 54. Had she continued living in India, not getting exposed to transnational and transcultural experience, a transformation of this nature would not have been possible in terms of identity. The train accident becomes a catalyst for Ashok's realization of the confined nature of his life he used to spend, which becomes a deciding factor in reframing his culture about identity. Each incident which had a significant impact on Ashok's life changed his identity, the train accident and the resultant immigration being the most prominent ones. Quote, "He was born twice in India and then a third time in America. 3 lives by 30. Lahiri, 2003. Prior to the accident, Ashok held a different view of life, not willing to venture outside his comfort zone and strictly performing his cultural identity as a dutiful son in a family with 6 siblings. Lahiri, 2003. He had no realization of his confined nature in life. Quote, "My grandfather always says that's what books are for," unquote, Ashok said, using the opportunity to open the volume in his hands, to travel without moving an inch. Lahiri, 2003. However, during the time he spent bedridden due to the injuries sustained by the accident, he begins to realize his confinement. Yet, he refused to read the Russians his grandfather had brought to his bedside, or any novels for that matter. Those books set in countries he had never seen reminded him only of his confinement. Lahiri, 2003. The traumatic experience causes him to change his mindset and therefore his culture-bound identity. The trauma prompts him to disregard his position as the eldest son in the family and transcend national and cultural boundaries. He decides to leave India and begin a new life in America. This scenario underlines the capacity of traumatic memories to redefine one's identity. It also suggests that identity formation is an ongoing journey or a process that cannot be fixed and pinned down to any static unitary definition. Identity is always a flux, always in process, never finished. Morris, 1993. Gogol is the character who is affected the most by his hybrid identity within the Ganguly family. Named after the Russian writer Nikolai Gogol, he finds his identity not fitting into either of the two dominant cultures, Indian or American. His name is such that it cannot belong to a homogeneous entity, part of it representing the Russian culture, Gogol, and the other the Indian culture, Ganguly. Therefore, similar to Ashima, Gogol fails to find an entity with which he can identify. Gogol is old enough to know that there is no Ganguly here. He is old enough to know that he himself will be burned, not buried, that his body will occupy no plot of earth, that no stone in this country will bear his name beyond life. Lahiri, 2003. Gogol's marriage to Maushimi is partly induced by his assumption that she is the entity he can identify himself with. Gogol has been feeling a sense of insecurity during his former love affairs as he dated American girls who had constructed a stable identity as representatives of the American culture, unlike Gogol, who is torn between the two cultures. For instance, Gogol feels that Maxine is in control of her relationships with both her parents and Gogol, given the homogeneous nature of her cultural identity. Forming solidarity with one cult is impossible for Gogol, given his transnational and transcultural position, due to which he could not identify with Maxine's persona. Maushimi, similar to Gogol, represents the second-generation Indian diasporic community, who is also in a state of in-betweenness. This shared hybrid identity, as a part of the diasporic community, might have led Gogol to form a close relationship with her. The conflict between the two generations can be regarded as a result of a clash taking place between the more homogeneous and heterogeneous nature of their identities. Although Ashok and Ashima are compelled to develop hybrid identities compared to Gogol, Sonia and Maushimi, they have acquired a more homogeneous identity given their upbringing in India. Gogol, Sonia and Maushimi have acquired heterogeneous identities in comparison to Ashima and Ashok because of their American upbringing as Indian immigrants. The conflict occurs when parents attempt to make their children remain in their culture of origin, which is an attempt to reconstruct a homogeneous identity. Quote, "When Gogol is in the 3rd grade, they send him to Bengali language and culture lessons every other Saturday, held in the home of one of their friends. For when Ashima and Ashok close their eyes, it never fails to unsettle them that their children sound just like Americans." Unquote. Lahiri, 2003. Maushimi can also be seen straddling the boundaries of two cultures and thus two identities, constantly resisting the adoption of a homogeneous identity. Given this duality, the reader views Maushimi being subjected to a state of inner conflict. She denies being restricted within a uniform identity as a Bengali wife, but at the same time desires the stability and security such an identity can offer. In her youth, she has vowed not to marry a Bengali man, which is a sign of resisting the Indian cultural values. However, in a bid to evade her sense of loneliness and insecurity, Maushimi finally decides to marry Gogol, compromising her resistance to embrace the role as a faithful Bengali wife, which had felt forbidden, widely transgressive, a breach of her own instinctive will. Lahiri, 2003. This contradicting nature between her innate desire to break away from the cultural framework and to find love and stability through the very framework replicate her dual identity. As discussed in the review, one can observe the way in which transnational and transcultural experience challenge the sustenance of homogeneous identities. They deconstruct the uniform nature of identities by constructing hybrid identities. Ashok's decision to immigrate to America was compelled by his past traumatic experience. This experience changes his mindset and therefore his identity for a considerable degree. This indicates the possibility of identity being reconstructed by traumatic memories, giving rise to the observation that diasporic experience is not the only factor conditioning the reformation of identity. Ashima's issue was that she did not have any entity to identify herself with. However, as the narrative progresses, the reader detects a gradual development in Ashima's character. Her identity as a Bengali wife assumes a hybrid status given her husband's death and her adoption into the mainstream culture. Gogol was seen straddling the two cultures, attempting yet failing to fit into the homogeneous identity. However, he later realizes that transnationality and transculturalism make it impossible for him to homogenize his identity. Maushami's dilemma also lies in the conflicting nature of her dual identity. Prompted by her hybridity, she is resisting the role of a Bengali wife, but at the same time longs for the stability and security such an identity can offer. The generational gap propelled by the clash between the homogeneous and heterogeneous nature of identities also caused conflicting relationships to be formed between the two generations. Therefore, it can be concluded that traumatic, transnational and transcultural experiences have significant influence on the reconstruction and redefinition of identities.